So since buying an RME audio interface and that becoming my main interface for my studio, and getting to grips with Totalmix FX, which is their software solution for zero latency monitoring, software loopback. Essentially, it is a digital mixer of sorts and it's very feature rich, but there is one feature that it lacks that really baffles me, and I think would be something that would add so much to RME interfaces that would really help make them an all-in-one solution that would eliminate a lot of other stuff that you typically need in a studio, like headphone monitoring cue systems, for example. This is something that isn't exclusive to RME and Totalmix FX. I believe anyway, most other audio interfaces that have similar software monitoring solutions, they suffer from this same problem. And this is the lack of being able to reorder input channels within Totalmix FX, or the equivalent software for any other audio interface. Let me show you what I mean with this. So you can see here I've got my Totalmix FX window. So in my studio I have, if I bring up the actual names of the inputs, I've got my 12 local analog I/O on my UFX3, which is my RME interface that I use. I've got the 8 analog line level inputs, which I have a Yamaha 8-channel preamp hooked up to that. And then you've got the 4 inbuilt RME preamps, and then AES, and then ADAT, and then MADI. I do have some input channels hidden here, I believe, which is one thing that I am grateful for with Totalmix, the ability to show or hide different input or output channels, which does help declutter. Like if you have a bunch of redundant outputs that you're not using, say you're not using the MADI line, you can hide those channels completely and then you don't need to see them. But what that doesn't let you do is reorder where any of these channels are, which quickly becomes a problem when you're using different hardware, outboard preamps, or whether it's compressors, any other hardware outboard that you might have hooked up. But specifically preamps with tracking, this is my big problem, where it just becomes a big mess very quickly. So you can see here from one of my last sessions, I've got some of my drum mics here on the Yamaha on the first 8 channels. I like my drums on a lot of those Yamaha preamps, so I've got my kick mics, hi-hat mic, rack and floor. But then where are my overheads? So I've got my room mics, 2 room mics on the 7th and 8th channel of the Yamaha. But my room mics, because I like those on my Golden Age projects pre-73s, they are on the first 2 MADI lines, which is what those preamps are hooked up to. Snare top is on my WA12 500 series, which is on MADI 6, I believe. Yeah, MADI 6. Vocals are before that because they're in the first slot of my 500 series rack, which is my Bart HRK preamp. Another room mic before that, and then snare bottom. What I would want is kick mics, snare mics, and then hi-hat, rack and floor, overheads, and so on. Basically your typical kind of band patch where you've got drums, bass, guitars, any other instruments, and then vocals. So it's all in just a really easy, quickly scrollable view, instead of hunting around trying to find because you can't remember, especially because you can't see both the name you give a channel and the actual input name. You have to switch on this names button. So I'd like to see that change, the ability to see both the input name and the name you give it, because I want to be able to label the channel, but I also want to see what input it's on. And then the actual ability to input, so for example, this 4th channel that currently my hi-hat mic is on, I could change that. So if you imagine the channels on Totalmix being independent to what the actual physical input is, which at the moment they are tied So the channels are literally tied to the physical inputs, whether that's an analog connection or over one of the digital connections. And they come up where they come up, and there's no way of changing that. If you imagine, and this is the way most live digital mixers operate, channels are completely independent from input sources, and same for outputs. And I could make that fourth channel MADI line number 6, which would then become my snare top mic. This to me is such a blatantly obvious feature that would make my job when I'm tracking, monitoring on the desktop app, so much easier and quicker, and I wouldn't get lost all the time with where I am. For artists, because I utilize the Totalmix FX remote apps on iPad, so artists can control their own headphone levels, which is a great feature to have, but it's held back massively by the fact that I can't put the channels in any order I want. Sure, I can show and hide channels, which is useful. So for example, with a drummer, they don't necessarily need all 3 kick mics. They probably don't need the room mics. So I could just show them the mic lines that they need to see, and that helps eliminate a bit of declutter, but they'll still have their overhead mics all the way over here in between a load of other stuff. So it quickly just gets very confusing for artists to use it. RME interfaces could be this all-in-one solution, so no need for any external headphone cue system. It's all built into the interface, and you just need some tablets. And that's another thing they need to sort. They need to release an Android version for the Totalmix FX remote app. It's ridiculous in this day and age that there's no Android app. And they seem very stubborn in their attitudes on their forums, so they refuse to develop an Android app, and they seemingly refuse to address this, which to me is just a massive problem, a huge fundamental flaw with the software. We need the ability to reorder channels, so essentially software patching like on a live digital mixing console. The ability to color code channels would also be very helpful. I'm not a software coder, I don't know the intricacies of what goes into this stuff and how difficult really it might be. It seems relatively straightforward because this isn't something that necessarily would need to require DSP of the interface, so it's not a resource thing that's tied to limitations of their interfaces. This is something that should just be happening on a software level on your computer. I think we're at a point where resources on people's computers aren't really an issue, so I don't think you can make the argument that computer resources are an issue. And really, yeah, this is just a visual thing with the GUI of Totalmix that needs changing. I'm guessing there would be some information that would need to be sent back and forth between your actual interface. This desktop app is a remote connection to Totalmix. Totalmix itself is on your RME interface. It's your RME interface that is running the mixer. Yeah, I guess maybe, if you were going to have channels independent from actual physical inputs and outputs, maybe that would need to happen on the interface. But RME have had years to address this, and they've been refusing to address this for years. In that time, they've brought out a multitude of audio interfaces, including the UFX3 that I own. It's not very helpful on their forums. They typically just give very blunt responses, shooting down what I think are very reasonable software feature requests like this, without giving any real answers to their customers as to why. I think it would be helpful for us to know why, if this really isn't something that's achievable. But to me, it just would seem like an obvious thing that RME would want to strive towards, because this would massively increase the feature set of their interfaces and therefore the selling points. Like, I know I already have bought into RME, but I'll be much more tempted to stay long term on RME if I can use it the way that I want to. Right now, I love everything else about my UFX3, but I am looking at alternatives because this is such a huge workflow issue for me that I need to solve. So, I'm constantly looking elsewhere at what other options might work for me. Right now, there doesn't seem to be anything that, would work the way that I want it to, but Yeah, I'd love to see this change. And you could argue this could all be done over patch bays. The problem with that argument is that you still have the digital connections on RME interfaces like MADI, AES, ADAT, and they're always going to come in where they're coming in. You can't change where those are coming in. Sure, with analog I/O, you could change where any of those ins and outs are coming up within that, say, your MADI connection. So, for example, let me show you. So you can see here, I've got my 2 patch bays, and these really are just dealing with the analog ins and outs of my SSL Alpha Link, which then runs over MADI to my UFX3. So in theory, I could repatch any of the analog ins and outs within my Alpha Link to create the kind of channel patch that I want for my outboard preamps, for example, when I'm tracking stuff. So if I kept, say, all my drum lines on the SSL Alpha Link with the preamps I want to use, then that way I could create a patch that would be in a logical order. The problem is those MADI lines are still going to come up where they're coming up later in the order of things on Totalmix FX. So unless I hide all the other channels before that, they're still going to come up like way later on in the channel list. Unless I keep everything to that MADI line, then I'm still always going to encounter that problem. Like, I've tried to think of the perfect sort of patch between my analog inputs, my MADI line and my ADAT line and so on. There's no way I could ever patch things with any typical tracking session that would make things come up in a logical order within Totalmix FX. So hopefully this has demonstrated why this is such a big problem for me and for many other people. I just think it makes tracking an absolute nightmare, both for me monitoring levels in the control room and then also for artists doing their own headphone monitoring. And it just seems like such an obvious thing to address. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Is there any way you can think of making this work, whether it's within Totalmix FX or another audio interface entirely? Any kind of solution that would be better than what I'm currently working with, let me know in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel, that always helps me out. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys again in the next one.